So, it happened again. At 23:46 of the 8th of January 2026, Ukrainian time, the Russians launched an Orezhnik missile at a target in the area of Lviv. The attack was confirmed by both sides, and for those who don't know, the Orezhnik is a revolutionary weapon, a long-range missile which releases 36 conventional kinetic warheads. It is the equivalent of a ballistic shotgun, something never seen before. It was used for the first time on the 21st of November 2024 on a large factory producing missile components in Dnipro. This recent attack is only the second time a weapon of this nature has ever been used. And yet there are plenty of mysteries surrounding this attack and the weapon itself. What exactly was targeted? How much damage was done? Why don't we see any credible damage picture? Why did the Russians use it? And furthermore, how effective is this weapon? Is it really impossible to intercept? On what platform is it based? What is the exact design of the system? What is the rationale of its existence? Is it related with the nuclear deterrence? So there's plenty to cover, but anyway, buckle up and let's get started. Welcome, I'm Gas. This is Millennium 7. Unlike the attack on Dnipro, which was filmed by a security camera overlooking the target, in this case we do not have good videos of the attack. The best one is probably this. On the left side of the picture we see 5 or 6 groups of luminous trucks hitting the ground. The delay with the impact noise is about 4.5 seconds, which means that the camera was at about 1500 meters from ground zero. The first 4 groups are clearly identifiable as clusters of warheads. The last 2 impacts seem separate, and it could either be a cluster that got spread more than expected or just 2 separate but compact clusters. With the Orezhnik, we expect 6 clusters of 6 warheads, but we don't have the guarantee that all have been captured in this video. There's another video from farther away that seems to show just 5 clusters and the flashes of 2 or 3 secondary explosions. So in this case it is more difficult to reconstruct the geometry of the impacts than in the case of Dnipro. I imagine that the clusters got intermixed or 2 fell exactly at the same time, looking like one. The other interesting factor is that while the final trajectory in the Dnipro attack was almost vertical, in this case it is inclined. It is really impossible without very accurate geolocation data to determine the angle, but keep this in mind because it will be important later. Both in the case of Dnipro and Lviv, the missile was launched from Kapustin Yar, which is a large test range near the border with Kazakhstan. The Dnipro is about 800 kilometers from the launch site, while Lviv is about 1600 kilometers, that is twice as far. So this is what we could see, but what we couldn't see was the target. The early assessment was that the Russians were attacking the nearby natural gas storage facility, which is the largest in Ukraine. This would fit very well with the current Russian strategic campaign aimed at destroying the energy production capacity of Ukraine. This hypothesis has several flaws though. The attack seemingly happened in an urbanized area while the gas facility is out of town. There was no sign of burning gas, that is fireballs or smoke columns. Furthermore, the Orezhnik warheads do not have the deep penetration capability that would be necessary to hit at least the pipes of the underground depot, but they would only destroy the surface infrastructure, which is still something, but it's easier to rebuild. And finally, the mayor of Lviv mentioned that the impact caused issues to the urban gas network. Now, after a few days, there are some claims that the gas depot was hit, but I don't know how reliable they are. AMK Mapping did a great job through geolocation, and he identified the most likely target. The target was the Lviv State Aircraft Repair Plant, in the vicinity of the Lviv airport, in the southern outskirts of the town. This factory has been attacked already, but apparently some MiG-29 and Su-24 repair and maintenance activity was still ongoing. But there's also a conspiracy theory. Well, not so much a conspiracy, to be honest. Some believed that the factory hosted a group of NATO counselors, Polish in particular. This may be entirely possible and compatible with the aircraft maintenance activity. The hint is that some Polish medical services evacuated people from the area of Lviv. These are little more than rumors, so take them as you wish. But there's another and more pressing question. How much damage was done? No pictures from the target area are available. There are some reports of an eerie glow above the target area after the attack, but we have nothing visual. The mayor of Lviv said that the damage was terrible, but he also said that a residential area was attacked, but there were no victims, and it seems a contradiction to me, to be honest. I don't believe we will see anything before the end of the war. The same has happened with the attack on the Dnipro. Ukrainians have shown a few damaged buildings and claimed that that was the extent of the damage. To this day, we don't have a drone shot of the Yuzhmash, and I don't think we will have one from Lviv as well. There is a very strict control of all the images that come from the target sites. After the first attack, for a while, it was impossible to buy satellite pictures of the target, and most likely the same will happen now for Lviv. But in the first attack, even when satellite pictures became available again, the Yuzhmash in the Dnipro looked basically unchanged, with just some minor damage in a residential area nearby. This is simply not credible. Even at the lower end of the damage estimate, something should be visible. I believe that there is some disinformation at work here, and this would not be surprising. Downplaying the effectiveness of the opponent's weapons is an official part of the American missile defense doctrine. And in fact, we have seen several publications, popular and professional, doing exactly that, downplaying the effectiveness of the Oрешnik. So, if the missile is useless, why did the Russians use it? Well, the multi-purpose explanation that is often well accepted in certain circles is that the Russians are just simpletons or plain idiots. And I don't really want to comment on this. The official explanation given by the Russians is that this is a form of escalation for the alleged attack to Putin's personal residence in Valdai. The Americans and Ukrainians claim it didn't happen, but if this was true, the Russians faked it to make a retaliation against a minor objective with a hardly effective weapon. Again, I don't know the truth, but this is really not credible. I personally suppose that there is a weapon testing component in the two Oрешnik attacks, but otherwise these are demonstrations of capabilities. I believe that the strike results have been downplayed, as I said before, because if these are demonstrations of power, there will be no disadvantage in showing that they produce just some minor damage. Actually, it would have been shown with plenty of details, like it always happens when the Russians make a mistake. So at this point, I guess we should ask, how effective is the Oрешnik? The configuration of the Oрешnik is most likely a two-stage system whose payload is composed by 6 MIRV buses, each one carrying 6 submunitions. There have been theoretical studies published in the Russian literature. The missile flies a ballistic parabolic trajectory. There are several possible mission profiles. One that makes sense is the following. The buses separate just after the end of the boost phase. Then each bus has its own attitude control thrusters, and they slowly rotate to point downward toward the target during the descent post-apex. At the apex, though, it is also the time to release the decoys if the buses feature any. The submunition may be released just after the apex if the missile is destined to absorb interceptors, or it could be released just before the atmospheric re-entry at about 50 kilometers of altitude to increase the accuracy on target. It is also possible that there is a third stage whose purpose is to release the buses at different speeds and attitudes to have them follow slightly different trajectories but hit the target altogether. This flight profile would further complicate the job of anti-ballistic systems. The Americans say that the Orezhnik is a variant of the RS-26, which is an IRBM whose development is officially suspended, but they never gave more details. Some analysts who can navigate the Russian procurement libraries say that some of the components recovered in Dnipro are Bulava components and some are Yars components. The former is a naval SLBM missile, the latter is a ground-launched ICBM. I keep thinking that a weapon like the Orezhnik would be better developed on the basis of a naval missile, but it seems that I am the only one, so... well, the weapon lineage would be important to establish the system performance from the performance of its individual components. But to play this game, we really lack data. In fact, I have seen throw weight estimates, which is basically the missile payload, between 1,500 kilos and 1,600 kilos, which would bring to radically different performance and effectiveness. In the same way, I have seen estimates of the impact velocity that go from Mach 4 to Mach 12. So, rather than guessing the performance, let's make a parametric analysis to establish a reasonable minimum and a reasonable maximum. Okay, I know, it is a wall of numbers, but please stay with me. This is a table with the weight of the warhead on the y-axis and the impact speed on the x-axis. Every table entry corresponds to the kinetic energy at the impact for that specific weight and speed. So, for example, a 100 kilos submunition impacting at Mach 10 will deliver 588 megajoules. Here on the right, we have the energy delivered by 100 kilos of TNT for reference and 3 examples of US weapons which are probably familiar to the English-speaking audiences. Sources vary a lot, and I believe that the American energy is overestimated by a non-negligible factor, but I used the higher values that I could find on purpose to put the Orezhnik in the worst possible situation. Furthermore, disclaimer, please consider that these are almost back-of-the-envelope calculations, and this is not a particularly sophisticated model. The low end of the Orezhnik estimates speak of 40 to 50 kilos of submunitions and a barely hypersonic impact, which delivers about 100 megajoule per submunition. With 36 submunitions, it is the equivalent of about 4 Mark 82 bombs, but spread in an area of about 300-400 meters of diameter. 2 F-16s with the same payload can do better in terms of destruction potential. This is totally unrealistic. To be honest, I don't know why I am addressing these obviously underestimated assessments, but there are a few around, so... However, the impact speeds most commonly accepted are between 9.5 and 11.5 Mach. 9.5 could be the case of Lviv because the trajectory was clearly inclined because of the longer distance and the submunitions will travel longer within the atmosphere, slowing down more. They have just more atmosphere to go through. In the case of Dnipro, though, the Ukrainians have measured impacts at 11.4 Mach with a near vertical trajectory. At the same time, there are various estimates about the weight of the submunitions. Some calculate it around 40 to 50 kilos, deriving it from the estimated throw weight of the RS-26, Others put it above 100 kilos because this would totally be possible combining some of the components that the Russians already have. I bend for this second hypothesis based on industrial considerations that I won't go into. Using a 9.5 Mach speed and a 50 kilo submunition, the energy delivered will be 31% of a Mark 82 bomb, and the entire missile will deliver the equivalent of about 11 bombs. That is about a flight of 2 F-15Es in practice. The most likely scenario, though, in my opinion, is a submunition of about 120 kilos with an impact speed above Mach 10, let's say 10.5. In this case, every submunition delivers about 90% of the energy of a Mark 82, with the missile delivering the equivalent of 32 to 33 bombs in a relatively small area. It is about 40% of the payload of a B-2, or the equivalent of 23 Tomahawks. And since I'm probably overestimating the explosive energy of the American weapons, possibly by quite a lot, the comparison should be a bit more favorable to the Orezhnik than it seems from these numbers. But even in the worst case, do you realize now why the damage estimates that we have seen are not really credible? Even at the low end, it is quite a lot of damage that should leave traces. Obviously, the energy can be delivered in different ways. An explosive bomb, well, it explodes. But the dynamic of a kinetic impact is different. Two different cases may happen. If the impact speed is above the speed of sound within the submunition, then all the kinetic energy turns into heat, the warhead vaporizes, and there is no explosion. If the impact speed is below the speed of sound within the submunition, then the submunition penetrates the targets while destroying itself. A lot of heat is developed in the process, and part of the submunition will still vaporize, but the explosive effect is much reduced. A Mach 10 impact speed is about 3,400 meters per second. The speed of sound in steel is about 5,800 meters per second. So, if the submunitions were solid metal, we would be in the second case, but with some explosive effect. However, the speed of sound depends on materials and construction. A non-homogeneous construction should slow down the overall sound speed, so it is possible that the explosive effect is quite high anyway. We won't know for sure till we see a reliable picture of an impact crater with the submunition remnants in it, if any. But now the question is, why the Orezhnik even exists? And I think that this is the area where there is the most confusion. First, albeit nuclear capable, the Orezhnik is not a nuclear weapon. It is a conventional strategic weapon, something that barely existed before. Second, criticizing its accuracy is incorrect because the Orezhnik is clearly not a precision weapon. It is an area saturation weapon. If we see it in this light, it is remarkably accurate since it was used to attack two targets near urban areas with minimal collateral damage. The submunition clusters are very compact and tend to hit mostly in an area of about 200 to 300 meters diameter. Third, wondering what might happen if the missile featured exploding warheads, it is probably not logical. If the impact speed is at the high estimate, the explosive would just be too slow. If it is at the low estimate, an explosive warhead could work, but it would be quite complex to fit submunitions that can slow down in a reasonably sized missile. They would need to be quite chunky. This is another rabbit hole involving an assessment of the ballistic coefficient, but I won't go into these details because this video is already way too long. Fourth, the missile is not unstoppable. Systems like the THAAD or the Aegis Ashore with the SM-3s should be capable of intercepting a weapon with the flight profile of the Orezhnik. However, since the missile deploys 6 MIRVs and 36 submunitions plus potentially decoys, it offers plenty of targets that can be ignored. 1 or 2 Orezhniks could, in theory, deplete a battery of missiles, opening the way for the actual strike. Considering that the cost of a single Orezhnik has been estimated around $3 million excluding the battery implements, it is a very cheap way of depleting interceptors. Fifth, the Orezhnik is a very cost-effective way of attacking targets at long distance. Even at the low end of effectiveness, the comparison with the cost of a mission of a couple of F-15s, for example, must consider the enormous infrastructure that is necessary to take those two aircraft to the target. Air bases, other aircraft in the package, tankers, the logistic trails, the pilot training, and all the years necessary to make all these components work together. In comparison, a battery of Orezhnik is a much simpler system that can be set up in a much shorter time with less training, and it's definitely easier. I know that the aircraft is reusable and more versatile, but the aircraft investment is terribly front-loaded if compared with the missiles. So, what is the role of the Orezhnik for real? Well, it is pretty clear now, attacking soft or moderately hard targets at long range. Ports, railway nodes, industrial complexes, refineries, fuel depots, but also air bases and logistics centers. In particular, the large NATO air bases, which are very difficult targets that require many hits, could be disabled or severely damaged by half a dozen missiles, probably. This weapon fits exactly inside the Russian doctrine of the so-called non-contact warfare, which explains a lot of the Russian choices, but this is a subject for another time. Furthermore, it is also an asymmetric reply to the NATO doctrine based on air forces, and a weapon that could be used for a conventional decapitation strike against a good percentage of the NATO forces. Obviously, there are also drawbacks. Well, the main one is that it is a destabilizing weapon. There is always the possibility that the attack could be confused with a nuclear attack, and the short range gives little time to discriminate, potentially leading to an involuntary nuclear exchange. This is a yet unresolved problem whose solution is more diplomatic and procedural rather than technological. If the INF Treaty was still extant, the weapon would violate it. The other issue is that it must be produced at scale to be effective. But it should be a relatively easy missile to produce, since the submunitions are very simple and it seems to rely on tried and tested components. I suppose that this is the reason why Putin and other Russian officials keep pointing out that the weapon is in serial production. There is no way at present to estimate the production numbers. It could be a few every year or one a week. We simply don't know. Now, if I can see all the points above that we have just described, well, I think the NATO officials can too, and I'm sure that they are taking notes, they're just not telling anyone.
大家好，我是主播林家远。生活压力大，失眠、浅眠是现代人常见的烦恼。太阳星全效克菲尔益生菌现在进一步推出晚安加强版，添加水染伽巴、色氨酸、茶氨酸、香蜂草4大天然草本。选择太阳星全效克菲尔益生菌，做好日常保养，身体轻松无负担。每日克菲尔，时刻美好 ，Good Feel Good。请上快点购为健康下单，输入推荐码有额外折扣。太阳星全效克菲尔益生菌基础版、晚安加强版，新包装改版，内容不变，抽取更方便，要吃就吃最好的。